Well, good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Wellbeing Zoom webinar on the gut microbiome. What is it and why is it so crucial to our health and well-being? And this webinar is hosted by Wolper Jewish Hospital, Friends of Wolper, and Crohn's and Colitis Australia. And my name's Julie McCrossin, and it's my pleasure to be your MC this evening. Just before we begin, let's acknowledge that we're all on Aboriginal land and pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm on the land of the Kaurna people coming to you this evening from Adelaide, and we have people from all over Sydney, but from other parts of Australia and some international visitors as well. Just before we begin, some housekeeping. A reminder that we can't see or hear you. We really want your questions, and in fact we've had quite a few questions in advance, but we want your live questions through the Q&A button. You'll see it down on the bottom of your screen, so please put your questions in starting right now and all through our webinar via Q&A. Our question monitor, Dr. Alan Schell, a local GP whom you'll meet shortly, will be monitoring those questions and will bring you, we'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible. You're welcome to have them anonymously. In fact, we'll have them all anonymously. And Dr. Schell will also be looking at questions via our broadcasting on Facebook. And a reminder that this is being recorded and it will be available on the Wolper Jewish Hospital website after our evening. And we will be sending you an email after the webinar. We love your feedback, and the program, its topics and its focus is built around what you request. So let's begin, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Alan Schell, GP, a long-term supporter of this program. And this is deaf sign clapping, and I encourage you to do it wherever you are. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you again, Julie, for being a wonderful moderator. This is the last Wellbeing for the year, and of course next year we'll have plenty more topics for you to join us with. This is certainly one of the most popular that we've had all year, with a very large audience, so thank you all for being here tonight. Wolper Hospital has been presenting the Wellbeing program for well over 18 years with topics of interest to the public to keep you out of hospital and also keep you in good health. And I would also like to acknowledge that Wolper Hospital is on the land of the Gadigal people, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And thank you again, Julie, for being here tonight. Julie's been a fantastic moderator for a number of years with us, and we do appreciate her input and her exuberance and excitement about doing these topics. Tonight we're also in partnership with Crohn's and Colitis Australia, and I'm going to introduce Leanne Raven, CEO, who's actually in Melbourne. And with the wonderful world of Zoom, I'll now hand over to Leanne. Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's lovely to be here tonight and to partner with the Wolper Hospital. Crohn's and Colitis Australia is very interested in the gut microbiome. As you know, the gut is so fascinating. There's so much we don't know and so much to learn. But with Crohn's and colitis, which are commonly called inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD for short, they're serious gut inflammatory conditions that people have. And we know that the prevalence is increasing around Australia. So at Crohn's and Colitis, we actually dream of a future where Crohn's and colitis don't exist. We want to be free of them. And we empower people to live fearlessly whilst we help search for a cure. These conditions are chronic and lifelong, and so we believe in being fearless. We believe in improving the quality of life for people who have to live with these conditions because there is no cure. There's more treatments, fortunately, that are being developed all the time, but we still don't know the cause and we don't know how to cure them. So we're fundamentally an advocate and an educator. And in 2019, we developed a national IBD action plan for the Department of Health. And it was a great privilege to do that because we got to talk to a whole lot of stakeholders who have a common interest. And of course, you know, this area of gut is so expansive And we've actually started to have some aspects of that plan implemented. So just recently in November, there was a new test that came onto the market called fecal calprotectin, which is a test that was in our plan. We wanted the government to list that on the medical benefits scheme, and they have now done that. And that's fantastic because this will help with the diagnosis of IBD. There's a lot of confusion around IBS and IBD. Irritable bowel syndrome is a functional gut condition and is very different from inflammatory bowel disease. People have some similarity in symptoms, but it's nowhere near as severe as inflammatory bowel disease. So this test will help there. It will also perhaps reduce hospitalizations and will enable monitoring to be far less invasive for the diseases. So we're happy about that. A couple of other things that we've done too. Only last week, we launched a course for psychologists on IBD. And a little while ago, we developed one for dietitians because we had people living with Crohn's and colitis who said, I can't find a dietitian or a psychologist who really knows anything about these conditions. So we have a platform called Gut Smart, and we have these courses running off there. We're in the process of developing one for GPs as well. So I'd like to talk with you, Alan, about that, how we can get the word out about that course. And another big project that we're doing is in the paediatric area. So we're doing an audit of all the paediatric hospitals around Australia, looking at the quality of care in that sector. And we're very interested to study the experience of children and families who are living with IBD, because most commonly it's diagnosed between the ages of 15 and 30. However, we've got little ones, you know, from the age of 4 who can develop these conditions. So it goes right across the lifespan. A couple of other things, we do run very helpful support services. We've got an IBD helpline. We've got a nurse line. You can ring up and make an appointment to talk with a nurse and, you know, talk about any issues you wish, and they'll help you develop a plan. We've got support groups. There's 26 of them around the country. So there's one in every state and territory. And because of COVID, a lot of them have moved online. So some of them, you know, are still face-to-face, and others are moving into the virtual platform. And then we've got programs for children. One of the things that we're going to be announcing very soon is we award PhD scholarships. And we've just gone through the process of, we had over 15, I think it was, 15 applicants for the latest round of scholarships. And they were really high quality applicants. We're only able to award 2, but boy, we'd love to be able to award more, because that's where we see our role in building research capacity in this area and supporting researchers. The other last thing I want to mention is in September of every year, we have our biggest event. You may have heard of it. It's called the Live Fearless Challenge. And it's a digital event that we developed before COVID. So this year, it was the 4th year that it ran, and it was the best year ever. It's an event where you set your own personal activity challenge. So we recommend doing 150 kilometres for the month, and you can do that any way you like. You can mix it up. You can do yoga. You can do running, walking, swimming, cycling, and you can set your own challenge. And we picked that challenge because people living with inflammatory bowel disease, there's a lot of evidence to show that increased levels of activities can help them in living with their condition. So we had nearly 8,000 people involved. We had 1,069 participants, and the participants actually did 6.5 laps of the continent of Australia. And we were so proud of that because, you know, it's a huge mammoth task. But I'm delighted to be here and to hear tonight all about the latest knowledge that we have on the gut microbiome. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leanne. And I think you've opened up a lot of the topic. with introduction. And I think for people to know that there's someone out there who may give them information that's not fake news, that's very helpful. So thank you very much, Leanne, and we welcome you here tonight in our support. And I'll now get back to Julie so we can answer lots of questions and hear lots of information. And thank you very much again for being here tonight. So we'll now go on mute and hand over to Julie. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Leanne, for those remarks. This is deaf sign clapping, which I just think warmth and enthusiasm is important in this pandemic era. Well, ladies and gentlemen, just before we bring on our panel who are hot to trot, we want to ask you some questions. And so I'm going to ask Michael, our mystery man behind the scenes, to put up 5 poll questions. We'll do them one at a time. I'll read it, you'll answer it, and then we'll give the answers immediately. And this is to allow our panel to learn a little bit about you, the audience. So, Michael, if I could have question 1 of our poll, please. What is your age? Just one choice here, please. Up to 40 years old, 41 to 50, 51 to 60, 61 to 70, 71 to 80, or 81 or over. I'll just give you a moment to click your relevant circle. Thank you. Can we see the answer, please? So there you'll see we have 6% up to 40, 6% up to 50, 13% between 51 and 60, 27% 61 to 70, 71 to 80, 39%, and a huge welcome to the 9% or over 81. Thank you very much. We'll have our next poll question, please. How much do you know about the gut microbiome and gut health? Nothing, a little, a lot. Thank you. The answer, please. So 22% nothing, 67% a little, and 10% a lot. Well, I can assure you those numbers will be different by the end of the night. Could I have our next question, please? Is the gut microbiome and gut health relevant to any of the following health issues? And you can make multiple choices. Please tick which ones you think are relevant. Cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, mental health issues, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, Parkinson's disease, asthma, Alzheimer's disease, all of the above. Please tick all the ones you think are relevant. I'll just give you one more moment. Thank you. The answers, please. So how many have we got all of the above? All of the above are 40%. And so just for the other 60%, all of those conditions are relevant. The gut microbiome and gut health are relevant to all those conditions, obviously in different ways, and we'll learn more about that tonight, but all of the conditions are relevant. Michael, do I have one more? Could you put it up, or have we done the 5 now? One more, thank you. Oh, no, I think we might have 2 more. Do you take a prebiotic or probiotic? Never, occasionally, regularly. Your answer, please. And the answer? 31% never, 40% occasionally, 29% regularly. Thank you. And our final question, please. Have you ever consulted a dietitian about your diet to improve your gut health? Yes or no? And the answer? 36% yes, 64% no. Well, look, thank you very much for answering those questions. And it's my great pleasure now to invite our panel members to join us on screen. Professor Emad El-Omar, Professor Nick Talley, AC, Associate Professor Andrew Holmes, and Terri Maister. Welcome to you all, and this is my deaf sign clapping. You should practice it. It's very cheerful and people enjoy it. Welcome to you all, and ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do in the next hour is to answer as many of your questions as possible, but we're basically going to, and if you've just joined us, you put the questions in the Q&A. They'll all be anonymous, and Dr. Alan Schell, a general practitioner whom we met at the beginning, will be monitoring the questions, and he will bring a selection of them to us throughout the night. And we are recording this, and it will be available on the Wolper Hospital website. Essentially, what we're going to do is to discuss what the microbiome, the gut microbiome is, and its relevance to health, and what role it can play in relation to prevention or the management of health problems. That's the nub of what we're doing. And I'll introduce each of our panelists in detail as I bring them in. I'd like to begin, if I may, by welcoming Professor Emad El-Omar, who's a gastroenterologist and director of the Microbiome Research Centre and Professor of Medicine at the St George and Sutherland Clinical School at the University of New South Wales. Welcome to you. Now, I'm going to get all of you to answer this because I think you'll all answer it slightly differently, but what is the gut microbiome for the uninitiated? Good evening.
Well, thanks so much, Julie, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you tonight. A very important topic. The microbiome is a kind of complex word, but it denotes all of the germs, the microorganisms that live in us and on us. We are surrounded by a sea of germs, if you like. Now, the word germ has kind of negative connotations, but a lot of these microbes are actually working for us. They're healthy inhabitants that outnumber our human cells. The bulk of this is in the gut, and this is why we talk about the gut microbiome and gut health. The word microbiome relates to the genetic power of all of those microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, viruses, archaea, and the microbiota is the actual individual germs and microbes. So it's a kind of, sometimes the word is used interchangeably, microbiome, microbiota, but it's all the bugs and the germs that live in and on us and have a major impact on our health.
And the word microbe, is that the same as germ? Are they equal in meaning?
So micro obviously is something that we can't see with the naked eye, so it's tiny, and the majority of these things would be things like bacteria and viruses and so forth. And germs, as I said, this has a kind of negative connotations, but if you like, microorganisms is perhaps a better description of the microbiome.
And what is the gut? Is that our stomach?
So the gut, this is our favorite organ. And just remind the audience, I'm a gastroenterologist, Nick is a gastroenterologist as well. And Hippocrates actually 2,500 years ago said that all disease begins in the gut. And he was very astute, and I think he was farsighted. And essentially the gastrointestinal tract is what you have starting from the mouth all the way to the tail end. So that's the gastrointestinal tract. And it's just one continuous tube, if you like, which has different kind of, conformations, but also accessory organs that are incredibly important, like the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, and all of these things. So that's what we kind of refer to as the gastrointestinal tract. The colon is the kind of the largest part, which is the distal part of the gastrointestinal tract.
Okay, so okay, thank you. And you when we spoke, Emad, you said it's really an extra organ and we have to look after it better. What do you mean?
So as I mentioned, Julie, we're outnumbered by these microorganisms, and they weigh about the same as the brain. So like 2 to 2.5 kilograms with their products. And they have the metabolic capacity. What they're actually producing is equivalent to the liver. The liver is a large organ, incredibly important. It's the industrial zone of the human body. So obviously they're very, very important and to our health. So to all intents and purposes, we can regard them as a distinct organ that is actually working for us most of the time. And if we treat it well, it works well for us. If we treat it badly, of course, we suffer.
And how do you treat it well?
Well, just by all the usual, good lifestyle that we like to adopt. Healthy diet, physical activity, exercise, avoiding all the toxins, having a positive attitude. All of these things can impact positively on the gut microbiome. And again, that translates into good human health.
And Terri Maister will be joining us later, the dietitian from Wolper, to remind us what those core dietary requirements are, because, you know, a lot of people are joining us to find out what they can do to be healthy. And the messages around diet are going to be familiar. And yet you're all so excited about the microbiome. So what is the relevance between this bag of this huge quantity of bugs and our capacity to be healthy and happy? What's the link?
So the link is that these microorganisms have a direct interaction with our physiology and metabolism and immune system. And these are fundamental processes in the human body. So the physiology is not in compartments. You don't have the stomach working independently of the brain, for example, or the gut working independently. Everything is connected. And those bugs are kind of the missing link. They're the ones that mediate that interaction, not necessarily by themselves, but what they produce. They actually metabolize and ferment materials that we send to them, and they produce metabolites, chemicals, that then act on receptors within the human body and impact on our immune system, on our metabolism, on our neurocognitive function. All of these things are relevant to that interaction. That's why they're very important. And
remind us what metabolism means.
Well, it's the making of things and the getting rid of the kind of the garbage, if you like. It's like the actual industrial production and waste disposal of the human body. So that's the metabolism, and of course it produces the things that we need and gets rid of the things that are the byproducts of that process.
Look, I'm going to bring in now, thank you so much, Emad. We're going to go very specifically to different conditions, health conditions this evening. But first of all, I just want to get even more a sense of the critical nature of this microbiome. And I'd like to welcome Professor Nick Talley to join us. And Professor Nick Talley AC is a senior staff specialist and gastroenterologist at John Hunter Hospital and a very distinguished researcher. I think you've published over 1,000 papers. I'm so pleased to see you're home tonight because you probably just work all the time. But welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Julie. I don't work all the time, I promise you. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. And you told me we're only partially human. Are you meaning I'm more microbe than I am human?
Well, Emad's already kind of mentioned this, but it's absolutely correct. There are about 30 trillion human cells, and there are 39 trillion approximately, roughly, microbial cells or equivalents in your body. So basically you are about 43% human. If you look at genes, you've got about 20,000 human genes and anywhere from 2 to 20 million microbial genes. You're about 1% human in terms of genes, 1%. If you don't have these microbes, by the way, if you did not have these microbes in and on you, as Emad has already mentioned, if you don't have those, you wouldn't be here. You would not be alive. Basically, they are critically important for us. We're important for them. It's a mutual relationship which can go wrong. And when it goes wrong, we can get disease. And when it goes well, we are healthy. So it's rather important to try to be healthy. And as we learn more about these microbes, it's fascinating how important they are in almost all the processes that matter, including eating well and being comfortable and, you know, not being miserable after you eat. That's microbes are very important for this, for making you feel better even. You know, the gut-brain connection, so important.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Could you just explain, because in the question, in our poll, we've obviously listed a whole range of conditions and we've said they're connected to the microbiome. But can you just explain this? Is it called the gut-brain axis? Is that the language? You know, what's the connection between all these microbes that I now feel a slight need to have a shower about, and how I feel and how I think?
So, Julie, you shouldn't have too much of a shower. So you need those skin microbes as well as your gut microbes. To be honest, you know, killing all the microbes is not the goal of what we want to do, in fact, to remain healthy. Yeah, look, your gut, and in fact, all your organs, but let's talk about your gut. Your gut is connected to your brain through nerves. There are nervous connections that connect the gut and the brain. For example, a big nerve called the vagus nerve, which covers a large part of the first part of the gut and also, goes up to the brain. And the signals go both ways. They go up and they go down. They go both ways. So they talk to each other. And the microbes produce all sorts of things like serotonin, a chemical. And that is important for that talking. Microbes in the gut, we now know, talk to the brain and influence the brain through those pathways. And we're only beginning to understand this. There's a lot for us to learn still, but we are beginning to understand that this connection's critical for a number of diseases, including diseases like possibly Parkinson's, probably Parkinson's actually, irritable bowel syndrome, and many other conditions. Anxiety perhaps as well.
That's what I wanted you to do. Could you just speak to that question of anxiety, which I think is an area of your research. So what do we know at the moment and what are you investigating?
So we study people with unexplained gut symptoms. Often they're called irritable bowel or other what are called functional gut disorders. And we now know that the microbes are disturbed in a number of people with these very common conditions. So these conditions affect maybe 1 in 10 to 1 in 3 Australians. These are really common conditions. And they're not always disabling, but they can be quite disabling and very unpleasant. So these are important, even though they don't lead to any problems in terms of, for example, dying of these diseases, but they're still very important. And we've started to recognize the microbes are disturbed and they probably drive some low-grade inflammatory processes. So you get these inflammatory cells, when you cut yourself and it gets infected, that's inflammation. You get this unpleasant sensation, but it's in the gut. And if you get even a low-grade inflammation in the gut, our research has indicated you are at an increased risk, a very high increased risk of developing the new development of anxiety, which you didn't have before, which says to us, at least we believe, is likely to be very important in some people who have chronic anxiety. That's speculative. We've got a lot more research to do, but it's very exciting because manipulating the brain is relatively hard. Manipulating the gut is very, very easy, relatively. So we think that's going to be important for the future if it all turns out to be, as we expect, closely linked.
Look, thank you so much. And I'd like to introduce now Associate Professor Andrew Holmes, who's a scientist, a microbial ecologist, which again is a new one for me, Andrew. That's fantastic. From the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Sydney, and he leads the Gut Microbiome node at the Charles Perkins Centre. So welcome to you, Andrew. I want to just come back to the notion of relationship. Nick earlier mentioned this notion that we have this relationship with our gut microbiome, and you said to me when we were talking, there is no one perfect target microbiome, because people are listening to this, they're desperate to know, what can I do to have this really healthy microbiome? And we're going to talk about that. But you say there's no one perfect target microbiome. The goal is a healthy, positive relationship with our own biome, and you compare it to a marriage. Can you just explain that and help me understand why this, bundle of microbes and my marriage have some similarities?
Well, if I draw on my ecology background, we're really talking about the concept of a symbiosis. So both Emad and Nick have referred to a mutualism or mutual association with the microbes. And what that really means is that we should be thinking of ourselves not as part human, but as a human that's more complex than we thought before. So we actually, to be a human is homo cells, the human scientific name, plus microbial cells. And that's the sense of a marriage. So in order for it to work optimally, you actually have to have a relationship between the two that's a little bit of a yin and yang or a give and take between them. And when things are working well, the sharing of space and resources and communication means that nobody's getting too upset with the other. So our body's not reacting badly to the microbes and driving inflammatory processes that cause collateral damage. And the microbes aren't aggressively attacking us and damaging our cells and causing damage there. So this idea of a marriage, and that when things go wrong, we don't just blame the microbes. We accept that there's blame on both sides. It could be the human side that's got the driving the poor outcomes, or it could be the microbe side, or in almost all cases, it will actually be a little bit of both. So that gives us a model to understand how to manage the system for improved function.
And if I could come to this question of diet, because I think we've got more of an understanding of what the gut microbiome is and its relationship to health. But of course, we want to know, what can we do to have this? We all want a long-term happy marriage. So we come back to this expression, you are what you eat. Diet shapes our health, but it's complex. So is diet the main way we're going to interact with this microbiome to keep it healthy and well in good relationship?
I don't know that I'd say it's the main way, but it's the main variable that we know about that's driving the changes in prevalence that we're seeing across the world. So if I take a step back, the Charles Perkins Centre was established really to deal primarily with nutrition-related chronic diseases. So that's the things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. That was the start. But we very quickly realised that essentially all of the chronic diseases have got similar factors that underpin them. And the common factor is that as our socioeconomic environment changes, these pressures that are driving the way that our body works has changed. And that's where we're starting to see these tipping over into disease. So the key thing to be thinking about, so we've heard from everybody already about how the gut microbiome is important in so many diseases. The reason why it's connected to all of those is that the gut is actually our body's primary interface with our external environment. Now, you might think it's your eyes or your ears or your skin, because they're the bits where you see what's going on or feel things straight away. But the two really fundamental challenges for any animal are finding enough food to eat and being able to survive the stresses that are hit upon you because your environment's changing all the time. And to get that food, it's got to go into your gut, because that's where we absorb the nutrients. And how you actually then adapt to changes in nutrient availability or in your environment, or react to that, requires that you've got signals coming from your gut to the rest of your body saying, well, how are we going to deal with that? And so our gut is actually where the rubber hits the road for our bodies interacting with the environment. And that's where most of our microbes are. So they're right at that interface. And we talked about the gut-brain axis. It's even more pervasive than what Nick was just talking about, because it's also the site where the immune system, which is how our body patrols who's friend or foe or organises body composition, it's the greatest development of immune tissue in our body is in the gut. The endocrine system, which is the hormones that are adding to those nerve signals that are going to the brain. So the hormones are going all around the body. The largest endocrine organ is those enteroendocrine cells lining the gut. And our second largest brain is the nervous system within the gut. So most of the signaling that's about what's happening in our environment and what's coming into us actually emanates from the gut, which is why it can impact so many different systems within the body.
Can I just ask you, and Terri, if you don't mind, I'm going to go to questions and then bring you in. Terri Maister is our dietitian in the wings, but I guess I can feel with the three of you this sense of excitement. You know, we're on the threshold of something really new and significant in human health, both as individuals and as communities. And I guess I'm interested, Andrew, what's caused this new way of thinking about the microbiome? What's brought it to the fore?
That's an easy one to answer. We've moved from a black box or a brown lump, if you think about those poo samples that we collect, to where we can actually take measurements. So the real breakthrough was the development of the technical term is culture-independent analysis of microbes. So as we've heard, there's literally billions or trillions of microbial cells within our gut. It's simply impossible to count and measure them, except with the advent of these high throughput sequencing technologies. And with the ability to measure, we can now see that there's these differences between healthy people or sick people. We can see associations between particular disease presentations or symptoms and particular states of the microbial community. We can see the response to an intervention, might be a diet, a prebiotic, a drug, or anything like that. And we can see that the response is also associated with change in the microbes. So seeing is believing, and it's driven this revolution in the science.
Okay, look, thank you so much. Well, I'd like to invite Dr. Alan Schell to join us so we can have a period of questions, and I will weave into the answers some information from our dietitian, that core reminder of the good diet. But Alan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Looking at the first lot of statistics from our poll, we have over 75% of people between the ages of 50 and 80. And we know from general practice that that group of people will probably be on 2 or 3 medicines for 2 or 3 illnesses, if not more. And with that, and GPs certainly have been highly irresponsible in some ways of dishing out antibiotics. So a good question was, how long does it take to recover from antibiotic onslaught on my microbiome? And should I be taking pre or probiotics off the shelf to try and combat that?
Now, look, I'll come to you, Emad, first, if I may. And could I get a quick answer to this both these questions from all 3 of you, because it's come through from a lot of people. Professor Emad El-Omar first, please.
Thank you, Julie. And that's a great question. And we actually have studies that have addressed that particular one. If you take, say, 3 antibiotics together, like a short course of 1 or 2 weeks, it takes up to 8 weeks for your microbiome to go back to what it was before you took the antibiotics. That doesn't mean that you're completely falling apart because of the disruption to your microbiome. We obviously are much more resilient than that. But just generally speaking, it takes weeks to get back to the pre-antibiotic usage. And then by 1 year, we've shown that, in fact, it goes almost completely back to what it was before. So there's a disruption in the first week, and then up to 2 weeks. And then, within 8 weeks, you're back to what you were before.
And sorry, the second aspect of the question, the probiotic, prebiotic question. First of all, could you explain what they are and then your thoughts on their utility, their benefit?
Sure. So probiotic is the actual bacteria. These are the bacteria that are supposedly giving us a health benefit. So things like the lactobacilli and the bifidobacteria and so forth. And they're enriched in certain diets like, the dairy produce and fermented foods and so forth. Prebiotics, these are not bacteria, these are not microorganisms, they're actual inert kind of substances that usually are constituents of plants, and they're the feed for the probiotics. So if you give them, the good bacteria can proliferate and multiply. So that's the difference between them. Now, in relation to the question, I think the very, very intelligent question about should we take probiotics when we take antibiotics. I wish it was as easy as that. Unfortunately, it makes sense. You might think I'm devoid of, of the good bacteria, so let me just take some supplements. The problem is that the studies that have been done don't necessarily show that there is a benefit, and in fact, in some instances, might delay the recovery of your microbiome to what it was before the antibiotics. So I think the jury's still out on whether taking probiotics will hasten the recovery of your good microbiome. The concept is valid, but I think I would just reserve judgment, and I'd be very, very cautious about advising people to take probiotics at this stage. That's my own personal opinion.
Thank you, Emad. Andrew Holmes, your thoughts as a scientist on this?
I'd add one extra little detail to what Emad just said. So when you take a course of antibiotics that wipes out the microbiota, there's more or less 2 phases to that recovery. When you're on the antibiotics, you've got very, very low density of microbes in the gut. So basically low mass of microbes. When you stop taking the antibiotics, that mass actually comes back quite quickly within 1 to 3 days. But the diversity takes the 6 to 8 weeks that Emad was talking about before you see that. So you'll get some fast growers bounce back quite quickly, but that's a very different community composition to what you normally had. And then the diversity takes a little bit longer. And that actually relates to something that's a fascinating question. You alluded to it before. Each of us actually has our own personal microbiome. And there's a really interesting theory about the appendix, that the appendix actually, it's often thought of as a useless little bit that the surgeons like to clip off. but it's one of the things that's thought to act as a reservoir to reseed the microbiome after a disturbance. So you naturally do get this flushing out of all of your microbes when you have diarrhea. If it's a particularly bad one, that's a similar sort of effect to what a course of antibiotics might have, where everything's gone whooshka and out the other end. And it has to come back from somewhere. And those various folds and involutions of the colon, as well as the appendix, are the reservoirs that let things pop back in. And that idea of taking probiotics afterwards is actually related to some extent to that same issue. When you take a probiotic, you're not taking a full complex community, which is what a healthy microbiome is. You're taking a purified set of 1 to 10 strains. And when they grow really fast, really quickly, because there's nothing else there, it appears that they may actually slow down or retard everything else coming back. There's no evidence as yet that they damage in any way, but they certainly slow down the recovery to what you had personally before.
So you're in essence saying they're not of good value. Eat well, take exercise, and let your personal microbiome rebuild. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't quite say they're not of good value. I would say that you shouldn't assume that they will be of good value. There may be specific instances where they actually, a good example of that might be in the infant gut, where you've got very different disease risks and a very different association with your microbiome. I haven't seen a lot of this that I think is particularly robust in humans, but in animal production, taking probiotics with antibiotics in the pig industry, for instance, there's pretty good evidence that that's beneficial in that context, but only with the very, very young, where that relationship with the microbiome is very different to what you see in an adult. So I wouldn't completely reject it, but I certainly wouldn't be blanket saying you should do this.
Nick, do you want to give us your thoughts?
So I agree with my colleagues, actually. So remember, you take an antibiotic, particularly a broad spectrum antibiotic, you are killing the bacteria, not only where the infection may be, assuming there is an infection, but also in your gut and elsewhere. You're not affecting the viruses or the fungi usually in the gut, but you are affecting the bacteria. And it does take time for this to repair back to what you hope will be normal. There is always a risk it will not be quite normal at the end of this process. That's one of the concerns. But I agree that using a probiotic, live bacteria, but limited numbers of what they are really, in terms of the types of bacteria you get from a probiotic, using these shouldn't be, at least in humans, routine with antibiotics. The key, though, is to not use antibiotics unless you need an antibiotic. We've overprescribed generally for diseases that aren't bacterial. Viral infections don't respond to our standard antibiotics, so they shouldn't be used in that setting unless there's a very good reason to do so.
Nick, could I just ask you a quick other question, and then I'll come back to Alan for another audience question. But just while we're on this topic, because it's such an older group with us tonight, there's probably a few of us, like myself, who've had chemotherapy to successfully treat cancer 8 years ago. So how long does it take for the microbiome to recover, and do you ever really recover fully? Would you have a thought on that?
So I've seen some data on this that suggests you can affect the microbiome from chemo, and this is certainly potentially an issue. We know that the microbiome affects cancer responsiveness to certain cancer treatments, some of the newer treatments.
What does that mean, Nick?
So basically, your microbiome can affect your responsiveness. So that can be relevant, and there's a lot of work going on in this area. But I think at this stage, you still need to be treated for your cancer, and this must be the priority in this setting. We just need to understand better, if we can, reduce any health risks with fixing the microbiome or manipulating the microbiome during cancer therapy. That's an active area of research.
Yes, I mean, I've had pneumonia and I needed antibiotics. I've had cancer and I needed chemo. I think this is your area, Emad. So a comment on the cancer issue, both in terms of our capacity to influence our response to treatment or prevent even. Any comments on cancer? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Julia. So one of the most fascinating issues related to this, as Nick kind of alluded to, is this form of cancer treatment called immunotherapy. So immunotherapy is basically using your own immune system, as it were, to fight off the cancer. And about 3 or 4 years ago, there was 3 very influential papers published in a top journal called Science that showed that you can predict response to immunotherapy based on the composition of your gut microbiome. This was a kind of a revelation. But it's not, kind of out of the realms of reality, because, as I said, the microbiome influences your immune system. So it makes sense that you can, it has some relevance. And in fact, this story has kind of really galvanized the oncology field. So there's a lot of interest in this particular one. Immunotherapy is relevant here to us in Australia because it's the treatment that really revolutionized the treatment of malignant melanoma. One of that was a major killer here in Australia, and now it just responds so well to immunotherapy. But this story has developed so much now that there are clinical trials trying to transplant fecal microbiota, like the poo, from patients who've responded to immunotherapy to those who have failed immunotherapy, to try and kind of overcome the resistance to the immunotherapy agents. And I think this is really quite exciting. And if I were to look in the future, I wouldn't say necessarily it's going to be poo that we're transplanting, but some essence of that microbiome that then works for you and allows the immunotherapeutic agents to be very, very efficacious. So I'm so glad that this story has developed, because oncologists were never interested in the microbiome, and now we have them all really kind of very, very queuing up really to be part of those clinical trials.
Well, I can tell you, as someone who's had cancer, I accepted radiation, I accepted chemotherapy, I'll accept poo, anything to survive. So, Alan, could I come back and have another question, please?
I think Andrew raised his hand there. You may have missed it.
Oh, I beg your pardon, Andrew. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on from that. I'm actually involved in the study that's going on in Australia with the Melanoma Institute and the Charles Perkins Centre that's looking at microbiome in immunotherapy. And the particular challenge with immunotherapy is that it's a real game changer for treatment of melanoma, but it's very, very expensive and it doesn't work for everybody. And that's a little bit of a barrier to prescribing it. And there's also another one that doesn't get talked about quite so much, and that is that as you would know, with chemotherapy and immunotherapy, there can be quite severe side effects. And the real kicker with immunotherapy is that you've got this combination of very expensive treatment, you're not sure if it'll work, and in a significant number of patients, you can actually make things worse, where they'll have these severe side effects, but not actually get any benefit from it. And the real value that's likely to come in the first instance with the microbiome there is exploiting this fact that because you have a personal relationship with your microbiome, it becomes a metric of your body state. So what we're doing is we're using microbiome measurements together with machine learning, artificial intelligence type programs to try and be able to predict what the outcomes of these interventions will be. So we had a multi-study country. The studies that Emad referred to were all terribly exciting, but one of the problems that came about with that fairly quickly was that they didn't actually have the same signal in each of those studies. So how you actually...
What do you mean, sorry? The same signal?
The answer that they got in terms of saying that they could predict a relationship between microbiome and the immunotherapy outcome in one study was not the same answer as they got in another study. So people were quite convinced that there was something here that might be useful, but it's not yet a reliable tool if you're not reproducibly getting the same answer in each study. So that's where we've gone with this next step, where we've done a study that's across 2 different countries, where you can have different microbiome prevalences in different countries, which is one of the factors that's thought to underlie why you get these different signals. And so it's looking more and more promising for being able to get these predictive tools. I think we're still a way off before it's truly clinically useful, but we're rapidly getting to the point where it will have applications for. cancer treatments.
Andrew, thank you. This is just so interesting. Alan, I'll come to you for questions. If there are any diet-related questions, I am keen to remind us that one of the things we can do is to eat a good diet and to get Terri. But I'll leave that to you if you can bring that in if there is some questions on that topic. Thank you.
As always, many of the people ask personal questions, so we're here to answer things generally. And I think that there will be a queue to Emad and to Nick in the future, because there'll be people who want to see the consultants, and even to Andrew to be in one of your projects. And I think one of the good ones that has come up, the issue around, and it's to do with diet, is I'm taking curcumin and vitamin C and other herbs. Is that going to help my microbiome? And how much fibre do I really need if, as you're talking, you need to help in the prebiotics, the fibre to help things grow. So I think there's two interesting, the vitamin C, and of course, Linus Pauling talked about stopping the cold with that one, but vitamin C, herbs, which you get across the, in fact, as we know, the world of the complementary medicine is almost equal to our really scientific medicine. So the answer, I guess, has to come around, what should we be eating and how much fibre do we really need? And am I supplementing by taking extra vitamin C and curcumin, for instance?
Look, thank you. I'm going to bring in Terri Maister first, and then I would come for comments from our clinicians. Terri Maister is a clinical dietitian and the kitchen manager at Wolper, and she's an accredited practicing dietitian enrolled in a master's in public health. And Terri, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I had thought I'd come to you sooner, but it's been a fascinating conversation. But remind us, we've heard earlier, we are what we eat. There's more to it than that, but that's also foundational and fundamental. So what are the core things that you're telling your clients, your patients, are the key things to be eating? And then we'll come to this issue of supplements.
Sure. Thanks, Julie, and thanks for having me. And it's been so interesting so far. I think what's really exciting for us dietitians is that this is a really new field and it is emerging. And there are so many questions that people have about it, but for a lot of them, it's a little bit too early. So this whole idea of personalized nutrition and all that that's where we're heading, but it's not where we are yet. So in terms of what we can do now and what we know now that works to change our gut microbiome and influence all of those other health outcomes that have been spoken about, is looking at our whole diet in general. So it's not focusing on one nutrient like curcumin or vitamin C. It's about looking at it, when we eat food as a whole. We don't eat food as a nutrient. So it's really about looking at the bigger picture of how we eat every day. So, we've learned tonight that we can change our microbiome relatively, quickly. Within about 2 weeks, we can change what our microbiome looks like if we're following a good dietary pattern. So that doesn't necessarily mean taking a probiotic. It might mean including foods that have more fiber in it, like fruits and vegetables and legumes and all that kind of stuff. It might also be looking at fermented foods, which were touched on. So things like kimchi or sauerkraut or miso, yogurt, all those kinds of things that feed our good gut bacteria. It might also be, looking at as a whole, reducing those super ultra processed foods, which we know have an interaction with our gut in a not so positive way. And I would never say don't include something in your diet, because again, we're looking at the whole diet as a pattern, not as a single moment. So limiting the foods that we know don't impact our gut in a positive way, and increasing those foods that we definitely know do.
And I think limiting processed meats and saturated fats. Just give us some examples of that, and then give us your thoughts on just meat, so a fillet steak or something.
So as I said, I'm definitely not someone to say don't eat that, because you have to look at it in the bigger picture. However, we do know foods like sausages, those foods that are so far away from their natural state, to put it in a simple way. Those are foods typically in a Western diet that we know produce gut microbiomes which are not as diverse and not as beneficial for our health. So it's all about getting that diversity. Sorry, I know I keep coming back to that, but I think it's more about focusing on what we should be including in our diet as opposed to what we should be cutting out, if that helps.
When we spoke, you said the biome should be like a jungle. What did you mean?
Yeah, I think that's how I think about it. I heard someone once describe it to me as your microbiome should, be somewhat of a resemblance to a jungle. You've got your flora, your fauna, you've got different species, you've got all of these different things which interact with their environment, they interact with each other, they interact with the food, they all respond to different food. And our gut does the exact same thing. So different types of foods will develop different types of responses in our gut. So for example, we've got a food group called polyphenols or phytochemicals, which basically have a really great interaction with our gut. So that's in things like tea and a whole bunch of fruits and vegetables. And it just comes back to that, very basic and very, not newsworthy conversation of what is a good diet. And it's diversity, it's whole foods, it's not, sticking to the basics. And it's as everyone has said tonight, it's relatively easy to achieve and with really good outcomes. So it's a really exciting time.
And just before I leave you, you've had this image of a jungle. I have an image of an Israeli breakfast at a good hotel in Tel Aviv, because a few of us tonight will have been to Israel, and I don't know if any of the gentlemen with us on the panel have been to Israel, but they have these huge breakfasts and many different salads of chopped up raw things, don't they? I mean, the one quick thing, alcohol, what's the message there?
Alcohol. I mean, there's some evidence to suggest that things like red wine, which do exist in a Mediterranean diet in moderation, do contain some of those beneficial things. But in general, following the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, you don't want to be drinking excessively. You want to be having, everything in moderation. And yeah, avoiding the binge drinking, which has probably been difficult in lockdown. But yeah, so. Well,
the data tells us so. We've been drinking and gambling to excess. But if I could come to Emad, I guess your comment on what we've just heard, but this question that Alan has brought to us about curcumin and supplements.
Sure. So the buzzword here, Julie, is diversity, as Terri just mentioned. And why is this important? Why do we want a diverse microbiome? We can achieve a diverse microbiome by feeding it, feeding the different members of that community what they need. So they respond to different parts of that plant-based, healthy, diverse kind of diet. Diversity gives you functionality. It gives you the ability to fight off certain threats. I always liken it to a group of people who immigrate or migrate to a new land, and you've got to have a lot of skills within that group to survive. So you can't have them all having one profession. You've got to have different people with different skills so that the community as a whole can benefit. It's exactly the same with the microbiome. And I think the way to produce that diversity is to give them a diverse diet that helps the enrichment of those, what we call the probiotic type microbiota, to grow. And that's the best way and the most sustainable way of maintaining a healthy gut microbiome. And when you took individual things like, certain herbs or certain, curcumin is fantastic. And there's lots of benefits to curcumin. There's lots of benefits to herbs. But as Terri mentioned, there's got to be a kind of a whole bigger picture of what the constituents are to look after a very diverse and healthy microbiome.
Andrew, if I could come to you, I go into a pharmacy and there's just walls of supplements. So, are the commercial pressures advocating for them, or are people asking for them?
There's a very simple rule with supplements. Unless you're actually lacking it, it gives you no benefit whatsoever to take it. So I thought the dietitian would love that. But basically the whole point of a supplement is to replace something that was missing. So unless you have actually been diagnosed with a particular deficiency and said you can catch this up by taking that, then you're wasting your money.
It's that simple. What about you, Nick? We're up against a lot of people want to take supplements rather than perhaps the rigors of cooking fresh food.
So we've already heard excellent comments on eating fresh foods, avoiding food additives, which might damage the gut through, in fact, increasing the bad bacteria and reducing the so-called good bacteria, and that's certainly potentially problematic. And we know eating lots of fruits and vegetables, a Mediterranean-style diet, for example, in particular, can be very healthy. But of course, a lot of Australians don't do this at all. They do the exact opposite of what I would call a healthy diet. And the fast foods, which are lovely sometimes and addictive, one could argue perhaps even, aren't particularly good for you because of their processed foods. But let's turn to supplements. You know, I think most of the commercially available vitamin and mineral and food substances that you buy at the chemist are, as my colleagues have said, an utter waste of time. It's even worse. There is some epidemiological data that suggests you may live less long on a multivitamin supplement than if you actually take it. It's not clear if it's cause and effect, but there is some evidence that there's a negative health benefit possibly to these multi-supplements. So I would warn people about this. But on the other hand, we've got to be careful here. We're still learning about certain food substances that perhaps in the right dose and the right setting might actually be beneficial. We've got to be very careful about this. The trouble is that isn't the science behind what's on the chemist's wall of supplements. Basically that's the problem. So I think we need a lot more work to know what's going to be really good for you potentially and relevant and what isn't good for you. But most of the supplements people take, they pass out in their urine or in their bowel motions, and it's of no value at all. It just costs money.
It's a hard message. Andrew, your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, I was just going to touch on that one extra point. There is one type of supplement where across our society, broadly speaking, we're deficient, and Terri touched on this, it's fibre. So the vast majority of us actually don't have enough fibre in our diet. And so that's one where that's basically a category of supplement where most people would probably benefit from taking it. Now, that raises another interesting topic that people might be interested in. So when we're talking about diets, diversity is a really key thing, but the one that I would actually emphasize is balance. You need to have an appropriate distribution or proportion of, in particular, the three main macronutrients, the protein, carbohydrates, and fat, because you need certain amounts of each, but you also need them in appropriate mixtures. And the one that, and it'd be good to go back to Terri after this, is that we should really be thinking about a lot is protein. Because if you're thinking about a balanced diet, I want you all to get in touch with your inner microbe here. You don't want your microbes on a crap diet either. And if you're giving them just fibre, that's the equivalent of giving your children just sugar. So the fibre is a carbon and energy source for the microbes, but they also need other nutrients to grow. So if you're feeding in lots and lots of fibre on a diet that's either taking in a very, very high amount of protein or a protein deficient, a very low amount of protein, you're actually going to be driving very, very different types of response in the microbiota, because different microbes are then able to exploit that according to whether you're a high protein or a low protein diet. So balance is the critical thing. You want to have your protein intake within the recommended range, and then you want to up appropriately with diverse sources of fibre what the microbes need. You're muted, Julie.
In primary school, there was that, that tower, and it showed the proportions. How do you respond to Andrew and your core guidance to our audience?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yes, please. Yes.
So we now have a circle, and but it still exists. And yeah, I agree. I think there is a lot to say at the moment about also fad diets and how our demographic are choosing to eat their foods. And there is no benefit in having either extreme, those very low carbohydrate diets like ketogenic or Paleolithic or whatever the other ones are. And it has to have a really good balance. So I guess, as I think Prof. Nick was saying, that there is definitely a benefit to following a diet like a Mediterranean diet. And a lot of those, there are pockets around the world where people are living the longest. And those are the kinds of diets that we want to replicate and follow that kind of pattern. So they do limit the amount of, red meats and the saturated fatty foods and the ultra processed foods. And they've got lots of fibers like beans and legumes and fruit and vegetables. They've also got lean proteins like fish, and all of those legumes as well contain fiber, and nuts and seeds and low fat dairy products as well, and all of that which build together to create that really overarching balanced diet that doesn't really favor one or another. And yeah, I think it just can't stress enough, it's about consistency. This is about a long-term game. It's not something that you can do for a week and think that you've fixed your gut, or you've changed your whole microbiota and you can go back to a westernized style of fast food eating. It's about making those small realistic changes, like going to the store and choosing sourdough, or choosing a really good brand of barley, or a different type of fruit and vegetable to introduce into your cooking every week, that slowly can then accumulate into this whole overhaul of it to put you in the best foot forward.
Thank you so much, Terri. Alan, can we have another question, please?
Yes, I think this is, again, a group of questions, and they certainly hit home to my personal, professional, and being in the office, and you had a younger person who's come up with a diagnosis of Crohn's or even ulcerative colitis, and then we have the option of doing a rather large operation where we take out parts of their bowel. Now, what's going to happen to them over the next 40 years when they've got less bowel to be able to manage their biome? So I think for our medical fellows here, how do you see, and particularly Emad has done work, and Nick, I know, looking at the issue around, and with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis Australia, looking to have none of those diseases in the future, how can we change things in that younger age group, and then how do they survive with less gut? Is actually a good question.
Could I come to you first, Emad, and then I'll come to Nick?
Yes, thanks so much. Again, a very important question. And in fact, traditionally with inflammatory bowel disease, particularly during times of exacerbation, so when the condition is very active, the medical profession kind of, advises a bland diet. I think that's just to kind of give the bowel a rest, as it were. But there's no reason whatsoever beyond the acute phase why people should not go back on a healthy, diverse diet, which has got, enough fresh fruits and vegetables and fiber and so forth, so that the risk of obstruction is no longer there. With the surgical interruption, obviously with operations, you're absolutely right. There is a removal of a segment of the gut. There is a very poorly understood but quite unique kind of adaptation in the remaining gut, and it's quite incredible seeing that observation where it's almost like the remaining segment takes over the function of the rest of the gut. And but the honest answer is that we don't have any specific studies so far about the changes in the microbiome in relation to that particular situation. But the same advice applies. It's just you try and maximize your benefit from your diet. Of course, with the resection of the gut, there is the possibility of deficiencies, dietary deficiencies. That's where sometimes the supplements might be relevant, because you are actually losing out on digestion and absorption of important nutrients. So that's one situation where there's got to be a discussed and all the potential deficiencies corrected. But the diet, as much as you can tolerate, the same diversity applies, the same principles apply, and hopefully that will allow you to maintain good health and a reduced risk of recurrence or relapse of that condition. But it's a very important question, and we usually have a multidisciplinary approach to this, and I think Terri would agree that quite often the patients who've had surgical interventions, particularly in Crohn's disease, are the most valued, and the ones that have the entire team looking after them, trying to maximize the benefit from all the different interventions.
Nick, could I come to you, please?
So Emad's already said this. So you can take out parts of the bowel and people can lead a completely normal life. So it's very important people realise that's the case. The bowel does adapt and you can go back to being completely normal. Doesn't, obviously there are risks of surgery, but that's important to recognise. I think there's some exciting work in the microbiome itself and Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, these inflammatory bowel diseases. So, for example, there's very exciting work, we think, on diet in Crohn's disease, very specific diets. There's some Israeli work, for example, that's been published, and some other studies as well. We're about to launch a randomized trial in Crohn's disease of a specific dietary approach, which we hope will reduce the burden of disease significantly. We'll have to wait and see. And of course, it relates to fixing your microbiome along the way. Of course, that's part of the work that we'll be doing. So I think this is an exciting time in terms of very specific targeted diet interventions. Once we know what they are, assuming they work, that might be one of the newer ways we approach treatment. And I want to mention one other new treatment for what's called ulcerative colitis, a specific form of inflammatory bowel disease. And that's fecal microbial transfer, poo transplants, if you like. And there's work here that's been, I think, very, very interesting, showing that a group of patients with ulcerative colitis who get a transplant can respond to this. Not everybody responds. Maybe about 1 in 4, 1 in 3, something like that. So a lot of people don't, but those who do get a good response. It appears, at least as far as we can tell, to be a very safe approach. However, it's still experimental, and I think we need to learn a lot more before we would recommend this routinely. But I'm just saying, changing the microbiome in some of these diseases is becoming potentially a reality. And I think eventually will change practice very significantly. But I'm very excited about the diet and treating what have been untreatable diseases in the sense that we've had to use potent drugs or surgery or both to manage patients with them.
Look, thank you. Andrew, would you like to comment on this?
On the fecal transplant idea?
Oh, well, it was a question really about Crohn's and the different colitis. Look, I do have a question for you, if I may, and then I'm going to come back to Alan for one more question. And you tell me, Andrew, if you're the right person, or you can refer me on. But, there's this talk about the Mediterranean diet. And I went on a holiday where I walked for 5 days along the Amalfi Coast in Italy, and I realised there was an aspect to the Mediterranean experience that had not been highlighted, and that is the hills. And that many people were walking up and down these amazing hills. Sardinia, don't they live forever on Sardinia? It's the hilliest place in the world. They even have little donkeys. They drag along tracks and put everything in these tin containers. So what I'm really raising is exercise. We've focused so much on diet as one of our modifiable ways of assisting our gut microbiome, but where does exercise fit in?
Obviously, hand in hand with diet. The term lifestyle is actually a better one to use with that. Exercise it's actually proven difficult to really pin down exact answers on that. It's pretty much unambiguous that exercise is beneficial and that it intersects also with diet in terms of how you're going to be driving the body system. What's a lot harder to work out and pin down is exactly how much exercise. And also it's a little bit like diet as well, in that I think most people probably have a perception that there's a kind of linear relationship between exercise and health benefits. If you do a little, it'll help, and if you do a lot, it'll help more. That doesn't appear to be the case. Which everyone should be pleased about is that the bang for your buck is better on the first bits. So a little bit of exercise is actually, you get really strong rewards quite quickly for little bits of exercise, and it's a law of diminishing returns later. So yes, exercise. I doubt that the hilliness of the Mediterranean fully explains the associations that we're seeing there, though.
No, well, thank you. It was just an observation. Terri, would you like to comment on this exercise factor?
Yeah, I actually read a very interesting comment about this idea of the Greek. It's called the Greek paradox. That what's happening is that these Greek people are coming here and coming to Australia and kind of moving away from the Mediterranean style diet and moving to, assimilating into a more westernized type of diet. But then as they're getting a bit older, they're starting to return to their roots. So they might plant a veggie patch, which is pretty typical, and they're getting active in doing that. And they might get a bit closer to their religion, which, has many days where they might be fasting in terms of, reducing meat and increasing vegetables and legumes is their type of fasting. And that whole idea of, doing that physical activity, the farm to plate concept, the, getting closer to your roots, they're actually living longer than all the rest of us. And they're actually living longer, than their counterparts in Greece. So it's that whole idea of the lifestyle, as Professor Andrew Holmes was saying, is that it's the whole lifestyle of what goes together with the diet and the movement and those incidental things that get you going as well. So
yes, I think I may have read that too. So they were thinking that the religious fasting was linked, the calorific restriction, if I could use that expression, was a factor. Andrew, would you comment on that? How does that, calorific restriction or fasting for part of the time fit in with our conversation tonight?
I actually typed an answer to someone in the Q&A that was on just that question. So anyone who wants to know more might be able to see that in the answers list somewhere. But both fasting and caloric restriction are essentially changing the amount of food material or nutrients that's going through your gut at any one time. And one of the things that we tend to ignore in, well, actually life everywhere, is time. And we should be thinking about the gut as something that's operating over time. And if you look at it over a 7-day period, instead of what you might see at a snapshot from one sample, then the gut microbiome actually changes continuously because it's got its own circadian and other rhythms that are associated with eating habits. And in crude terms, you could think about our gut microbiome as having 2 shifts, not a night shift and a day shift, but a fasting shift and a fed shift. And in the fed shift, you've got a suite of microbes that are geared to operate on the food materials that are coming in, particularly the ones that our body can't deal with, which will be the fiber, etc. But in the fasting shift, you've got a next group of microbes, and they're doing a couple of different things. Basically, the food's gone, so they've got to work on different things, and they're utilizing the waste products of the ones that went before. So they're cleaning up the shit that we don't want going into our body and using it for themselves. They're also operating in an environment where most of the protein has been absorbed by our body. So that competition for protein between microbes and ourselves is over. And they're now operating off other sources of nitrogen for them. And that's where one of the most fascinating things about this whole symbiosis idea comes about. One of the things that we haven't really talked about yet is how we pay for our microbes. We might think that it's what we eat, but actually the way that we really pay for them, we give them something that they can't otherwise get, is mucus and urea and other nitrogenous waste. So the way our body works, we secrete stuff into the gut. A large part of that is mucin. Another bit is roughly half of our nitrogen excretion. We think of urine as being where most of it goes out, but a lot of it actually goes into the gut. So our bodies are designed to fertilize the microbes with that, which supports their growth. So the fed shift operates off what goes in our mouth. The fasting shift operates off what we're paying to them to keep them there to do things. And they swap a lot of the goodies back to us that you'll hear about in any paper that you read there. So a lot of the exchange is actually dependent on things that happen in fasting, and which is thought to be why caloric restriction and intermittent fasting diets can drive beneficial outcomes in the long term.
Fascinating. Look, Alan, is there a question that's really significant that we should get at least one of our panel members to cover?
Well, we asked the body of people who attended tonight the health issues, and I'd be interested to hear of the effects of, or is the gut biome or misbiome, the one that's not working, a cause for cancer, for Parkinson's disease and asthma, and even Alzheimer's disease. And I'd be interested to see where, and maybe Emad and with Nick, when we talk about these, where the GP and looking after patients with a number of these conditions, how much of their poor diet caused the problem. And we talk about Parkinson's disease, which is, I'd have to say, a bit newer to me, that there is an interesting cause or potential cause for gut health promoting onset of Parkinson's disease. That'll be interesting also for the audience here.
So Emad and Nick, I'm going to come to each of you and ask you just to speak for 2 or 3 minutes each, if I may, because we're coming close to the end. But this causal relationship between the gut biome and common health problems. Emad, you first, please.
Thank you, Julie. So I'll deal with cancer perhaps. There is absolutely no doubt that the gut microbiome is relevant to certainly gastrointestinal cancers. So colon cancer, stomach cancer, pancreatic cancer are all emerging as ones that are directly influenced by the composition of the gut. And a lot of work has gone on over the last 10 to 15 years and identified kind of key bacteria, key microbiota that are directly involved in the sense that they can cause inflammation. It's all about this low-grade chronic inflammation that activates all the pathways that can lead to cancer. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a week or a month. It happens over 20, 30 years. So that's where the composition of the microbiome over a long period can lead to the development of something like this. Otherwise, we would all have perished by now. So to a great extent, things like colon cancer, absolutely, because it's swimming in it. That's the site of all of the damage, if you like. But more interestingly, things like pancreatic cancer, a horrible killer. It's one of the worst cancers of all. But now there's a lot strong evidence linking it with, for example, the oral microbiome. So this is the microbiota inside the oral cavity, and how certain types of bacteria that grow, particularly in the oral cavity, have been implicated in pancreatic cancer. Very exciting stuff. And we've now moved away from associations, just finding a different microbiome in those cancer patients compared to normals, into mechanistic studies actually showing how this is happening. And this is very exciting indeed. So in terms of cancer, the actual causation of cancer, there's definitely a lot of work, a lot of evidence to show that the microbiome is important. And in terms of intervention, we've got to be careful because it's something that you can reverse. Something that's taken 20, 30 years is not going to be reversed easily, but we can adopt those lifestyle changes that are going to be protecting all of us, not just from cancer, but from all the other illnesses that we've mentioned today. So diet, exercise, all of these positive factors. The gut-brain connection, I think I'll let Nick address in terms of Parkinson's and other things.
I will. And just before I go from cancer, I guess, should we give a message to our audience? There may be people with us tonight who have these cancers, and am I right in saying that causation of cancer, so number one, they should seek medical advice about particular issues relevant to themselves from their clinician, but secondly, that there's no simple cause and effect in this area, is there? Because people can feel guilty they've somehow brought it on themselves.
Oh, not at all. I mean, this is one component out of some, I always liken it to the perfect storm. As I said, we're resilient. I mean, we're not falling apart with just one thing going wrong. So you've got to have, the wrong genes, the wrong diet, the wrong lifestyle, and then perhaps you screw up your microbiome. And then eventually, if you're not taking enough of the protective factors, something might happen. So it's just generally speaking, we're heading towards that kind of era of personalized medicine. And I think that is really the exciting aspect of this microbiome, because we can change one aspect. We can't change our genes, but we can change the microbiome, and we can certainly change our lifestyle. So I think that's where, the field is kind of slowly progressing, where we can predict the risk of disease and can institute measures that would protect us.
Look, thank you, Nick. Could I have a comment from you? And I will come to you, Andrew, for a final comment in a moment as well. But Nick first, thank you.
So I'll be quick, Julie. It's a complex area. Let's talk about Parkinson's disease. So there's good evidence now that, at least in some cases, perhaps many, Parkinson's disease begins in the gut. And in fact, one of the initial symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and this can precede Parkinson's disease by many years, is constipation. So people develop constipation, and then later in life, they develop Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease probably begins decades before you get the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And there's evidence as well, it's emerging evidence, that the gut microbiome is disturbed in Parkinson's disease and possibly plays a role. So we're doing work on this, for example, in our centre. We're studying very early Parkinson's because that's where we're trying to identify if there's a signal there that we can intervene with that may make some sense. Of course, there's a long way to go to proving this, but it's a devastating disease. And so we feel it's a terribly important mission to study this. And there are many other groups doing this as well, but we feel our work's of great interest. And look, the other diseases you mentioned are also relevant, clearly. And what's so interesting is, for example, asthma, very commonly associated with gut disease. There's a clear interrelationship between asthma and irritable bowel syndrome and stomach discomfort, very clear. And that sort of suggests that they have a common pathogenesis. And there's a lot of work going on trying to sort this out, with some really exciting answers coming up recently. So I think, again, a fascinating area that we're going to see more work in, and hopefully some new treatments and tests as well going forward.
Look, thank you so much. And if I could come to you, Andrew Holmes, can you give us your thoughts on personalised medicine versus the identification perhaps of groups of people who could benefit in particular ways?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, personalised medicine is something that's always going to be most useful for the rich, whereas stratified medicine, as I like to think about it, where we might be able to identify broader groups of people, is something that might be much more relevant as a real-world solution, because for most of these nutrition-related chronic diseases that are the real burden on the health system in a monetary sense as well as a personal sense, they're actually diseases that are predominantly in the poorer socioeconomic groups, where personalised medicine is not going to be a realistic deliverable. But if we can have relatively cheap and mass output things that are more targeted to broader groups, that could well be, well, it's my vision, and it's something that we've been looking at in a number of different contexts there. If I could, do I have time to touch briefly on something else with the disease?
Yes, just quickly, please.
So DOHAD is a term that hasn't come out yet. It's an acronym for Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. And we've touched on a bit with the various immunological disorders, atopic things, so asthma, allergies, etc., are all things that are dramatically increasing in frequency. Type 1 diabetes is another immunological disorder. And there's some fascinating stuff that's shown that what happens in early life, infancy to early childhood, essentially, if you've got differences in the microbial development, then they play a key role in the early education of the immune system that significantly influences the risk of development of these sorts of disorders. So it's a bit like the story with cancer. There's not one really simple cause, but there are mechanistic insights now into what really shifts the risk patterns. And there was a particularly interesting study done in a population that straddled the border between Finland and Russia. And on either side of the border, they had very different policies regarding use of antibiotics in childhood, but similar ethnic groups and similar diets otherwise. And there was a particular group of bacteria that were different in the infants either side, and the frequency of diabetes was very, very different. And what that was discovered was that one of the molecules that's a potent initiator of early immune signals was actually different between these bacterial populations. And there's actually some interest in looking at that as a new type of pharmaceutical as well now, because it signals differently to the immune system. So what happens in early childhood, particularly with these immunological disorders, is another one that's of great interest.
And just because there's so many grandparents online tonight and some parents, in a nutshell, what should we be doing in that first year of life in terms of modifiable things we can do to give our kids the best kickoff?
Don't use antibiotics unless you have to. But I should also add, and especially because we've got physicians here, do use antibiotics if you need to. There are times when you really do need to use them. So don't be afraid of them, but don't use them willy-nilly. Have a pragmatic weaning program. So not too early introduce the solid foods carefully and introduce them as part of a varied diet as well, and avoid ultra-processed foods pretty much at all times.
Look, golly, I've enjoyed this. Thank you from me, and I will hand over to Alan Schell to close proceedings, but can you give each other a clap, because that was just tremendous. Thank you.
Well, I always want to say a very big thank you to Julie for being our moderator tonight and holding things together. And I have to say it's fantastic to have Terri and Andrew and Emad and Nick here. And I think giving of your time and your knowledge has been fantastic. And I'm sure everybody, there's too many questions and we can't answer all of them. But I would have to say that if you're concerned about your diet, yes, there are some wonderful nutrition and lifestyle advisors. But I think what we do have in Australia is very highly qualified licensed dietitians and nutritionists. So look at being referred to somebody that you can talk to with your GP. I think that's most important, and that'll be both in the private and in the public sector. We have that in this country. We're very lucky. And don't be scared to talk about the things we've talked about here. And I guess if you can get to see Nick up in Newcastle or Emad at New South Wales Uni, that's great. But there are many other specialist colleagues of these fine gentlemen, including Andrew, who I'm sure are out there to help you in what is a very large topic. And as you're all saying, it's a changing target. We've learned a lot more in the last 10 years, and we're going to learn a lot more in the next 5 or 10 years with all the projects you're talking about. And thank you to Leanne and her group. Again, some things that have been raised there with testing, which is new. There are some things at the chemist. I'm not sure whether they're valid, but I think from Leanne with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, I think we have to at least utilise those services that are out there. So please don't be afraid to get in touch with them. And for everybody, any information we give tonight, I know that Michelle and Ruth will provide that with you in a follow-up. It is available. This is a recording, so you can go back and learn a bit more by reviewing this recording. It is the last one of the year, and I can tell you that we've already got a number of topics sorted out for next year. So we use your email only for promoting these events, not to send to anybody else. So don't be afraid to give us your email. Also to look at for a post-webinar email that we love your feedback and survey. Can we do a better job? I think we've done a great job over the last 18 years. We'd like to always make sure we continue to do so. And that we look forward to you attending next year. We wish you all the best for the coming festive season and really a healthy and very healthy next year. And look at what you eat. We are what we eat, and we've learned a lot of that tonight. So with that, I say thank you to all. Thank you to the audience. Have a good night and stay safe.
Thank you so much. And we will now conclude our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.